Welcome, my name is Vince, and we are getting into end time Bible fulfillment in sequential order. Now, many Bible believing Christians do not think that studying eschatology, that's the study of the last days, is important. They just believe that if they trust Jesus by faith and they do not work for their salvation, that everything will be fine. But either our generation or we could be preaching to the generation that is going to go through this. Don't you know that God warns before he hits? And if you hear that warning, you know exactly what he is doing and why. And that should develop your confidence and your hope in the faith that you have. This study is entitled The First Birth Pang because it introduces the first kingdom into the war that Antichrist started. We will also learn about the red horse rider of Revelation 6 in this study. And what's great about this study, Antichrist wets his pants. He gets scared. Let's go on and take a look at this exciting thing that God is going to show us today. Okay, let's kind of pick it up where we left off. The war, our last episode, we found out that the Antichrist was attacked by the king of Syria. And as a result of that, he defeated the king of Syria, the king of the north, and then he also defeated the king of the south. So he entered via Iraq because he is referred to as the king of Assyria, entered into Syria, passed through, and then he went into Egypt, and he passed through that land too, making it all the way through the land and nearing the borders of Libya and Sudan. Now, he, according to Daniel 7:24, replaced these two rulers. So now he is in control of Iraq, being the king of Assyria. He is in control of Iraq. He is in control of Syria, and he is in control of Egypt. But oddly enough, after it says he will pass through Egypt, what becomes funny, it says the land of Egypt will not escape. Furthermore, dependent on the Bible translation that you have, he says the Libyans and the Ethiopians will follow at his heels, or if you have an American Standard or King James, it says that Libyans and Ethiopians are at his steps. Very confusing words. But I think there's a good reason why the Bible translators worded it this way, because sometimes Hebrew is very difficult to translate. So now something unexpected happens. This is where we are at now. Something happens here that changes the course of Antichrist. And what we learn is in Daniel 11:44 that it is from rumors from the east and from the north that disturbed him, that disturbed the Antichrist, result in him running scared. Yes, he is very much afraid. Let's talk a little bit about these unexpected rumors. Let's talk a little bit about Daniel 11:44. Now, we know where he's at. He's in the land of Egypt. He's about to get to the border of Sudan and about to get to the border of Libya. So Sudan would probably be considered part of Ethiopia at the time that the scriptures were written in Ezekiel. Now, I mentioned Iran out of the east, and you're going to see in a second how I associated Iran coming into the picture. Same like it, I associate Russia being the rumors that are coming from the north. So out of Russia, we are getting more rumors. Antichrist is hearing things about them, and what he's hearing greatly disturbs him. The Antichrist is getting scared, so he's got to take into consideration his situation. Now, oddly enough, in Daniel 11:42, we see something very, very unusual. We know he had entered the land of Egypt, and he had passed through it. He was coming up to the border of the land of Egypt, both at the Libyan border and both at the Ethiopian/Sudan border. These words say something very weird in 1142 for someone who's just passed through the land. It says the land of Egypt will not escape. And that becomes very important because when we saw earlier in Daniel what it was talking about, we recognized that these nations were at his steps. He was about to enter them. And then we also recognize the same verses were translated at his heels. Well, how could you be at the steps but be at the heels? Well, what we're doing is we're getting an interesting clue here by this Daniel 11:42 and 11:43. When we look at it, he says the land of Egypt will not escape. Therefore, the implication is it seems like the land of Egypt is going to escape the Antichrist, but they will not. And it's confirmed that they will not in Daniel 11:43 by where it is written, but he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. So they do not escape. Therefore, the Libyans and the Ethiopians, as the Antichrist is turning and going back toward the beautiful land, going back toward Israel, they will follow at his heels or after his steps. Literally, they are now in pursuit as he withdraws and retreats, trying to go to Israel to protect that nation. Let's get into our first birth peg. Now, what we have is a reference that we looked at earlier, and in our previous video, it was discussed talking about Isaiah 19:2. And we learned that the Middle East conflict of the tribulation period would start by Egyptians fighting against Egyptians, a civil war, and then it would lead to city against city. And from that previous video we watched, we learned eventually it would become kingdom against kingdom. So this is an important phrase here, kingdom against kingdom. Why is it important? Well, because we have the same phrase in several of the Gospels, where Jesus says, for nation will rise against nation, and there it is, kingdom against kingdom, and he says earthquake, famine, and so on, merely the beginning of birth pangs. So if we understand that our birth pang must start with a nation against nation, exactly what Isaiah 19 omits. But what happened that we learned from Daniel 11? We learned because of this event that happened in Egypt, that the Egyptian ruler would influence the Syrian ruler, who would attack the Antichrist, who is the leader of Iraq. And from that now you have Syria against Iraq, and you have a nation against nation. Eventually, or very quickly, he would defeat the Syrian leader and then move on and defeat the Egyptian leader, where later on he would retreat. That's where we're talking about right now. He's retreating back to the land of Israel. Well, these sort of associations become very important. They're called building a family. Other times they're used as a remez. They are hinting for us to look at something in another passage. So we have to depend on the Spirit's leading us to look at these passages, and the Spirit's dependence to help us interpret these passages as well. Let me give you some examples of what we're talking about. See, I go into chapters like Ezekiel 38, Daniel 11, Revelation 6:4, a verse there, and Daniel 7, and Daniel 7 uses beast there, and I do an association. Does it associate to other chapters, to other verses in the Bible? For example, in Daniel 7, you have the words beast. You have a lion-like beast that has wings. You have a bear that has ribs in his mouth. You have a leopard that has 4 heads. And then you have the beast of the Antichrist that has different features and is different from the other 3. Well, the word beast here makes me want to look for beasts in other areas. And the only other place I find beasts is not here. but here and there without a reference to the end times. So this becomes very important because I'm saying Daniel 7 is an end time reference. We will look at that later, why it is. Examples of what associations might come from, for example, are things like nation. Who's involved? Now, when we looked at Daniel 11, we found that the Libyans and Ethiopians involved. So, just out of the blue, did I go and select Iran and Russia as being where the rumors came from? The rumors came from the east and the north? No, it was not. It was because of Ezekiel 38:5, a verse that includes the Ethiopians, the Libyans, and the Persians, which is what Iraq is, and it was all within the context of Gog, who is the leader of the Russians' territory. So this becomes very important when we look at it. We look at other things like swords and chariots, things that are used for battle, instruments that are being spoken about, baskets, it could be anything, pottery. We also look at things like timing. Does it fall into the same realm or time span of the other events? For example, we know the Antichrist is end times. So we learn about the horn that is on the beast, or we're learning about the beast. We know he functions during the final 7 years of the tribulation period. Ezekiel likes to use the term in that day. A few translations say on that day. But in that day is a reference throughout the entirety of the Bible to the coming of Christ's return. In other words, it incorporates the immediacy before it and the time during he is returning to earth. So therefore, it is inferred to be end times and associated with the Antichrist. This is what they call interpretation by associated concept. Latter years is used in Ezekiel 38. Last days is used. So we have these end time associations that bring us all to this particular point. Now let's look at the clues. We have Ethiopia, we have Libya, we have rumors from the north, Russia, rumors from the east, Persia. We have the same timing of the events in that day, the last days. We have the same equipment being used. So from all this, we are able to build on and be able to put together a picture, pieces to the puzzle coming together that give us a picture of what else is happening. Places are great for being able to determine association. A people living in security in the land is a reference to Israel in Ezekiel 38. The beautiful land is a reference in Daniel 11. So we have these two references that point to Israel. The event is talking about the same place. Therefore, in Revelation 4, we could look at sword in association with somebody who's devouring much flesh. In other words, the beast of Daniel 7:6 is killing. He's devouring his opponents or his enemy. Then we look at things like granted to take peace from the earth. This is pretty important too, because in Ezekiel it says he will take peace from Israel. So the idea of this taking of peace builds an association, because from the land of Israel, where it is all going to start, it is eventually going to go out throughout the entirety of the globe and affect other places throughout the world. So who is this Gog that we often hear about in Revelation and in Ezekiel? Well, you're going to be surprised, but he is the rider of the red horse. Or maybe you won't be surprised. I don't know. Now, what we understand is the horse rider is mentioned in Revelation 6 in verses 3 and 4. However, just earlier in that same chapter, we had read about the Antichrist. This is on a previous video. So Antichrist was initiated first as a character to get the ball rolling in these final days. Now, Gog is being released to do his job. And this is what it says in Revelation 6, verses 3 and 4. And when he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come." And another, a red horse went out. And to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men should slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. So he's got a job here to do, and that's unfortunately to take peace and get people killed. That's not a good job to have. I definitely wouldn't want it. But what we want to look at is during this period of time, there are a lot of disastrous things going on earth. But the point I wanted to make when we understand what he's doing in this particular event that we're studying over here, this particular role is given to him and initiated from heaven. It's not something that he does. As a matter of fact, in Ezekiel 38:4, it says that God puts hooks in his jaws and turns him about. It's almost like he wants to walk away from doing this job. But later on, we will look at other verses in Ezekiel 38 that show that he has a plan and that he wants to do it. So it's almost like God is saying, okay, I'm going to turn around because I'm just giving him the opportunity to do what he wanted to do anyway. Now, this particular job of taking peace from the earth, we have to recognize is granted also from heaven. So it's initiated from heaven, and now he is given permission from heaven to do it. So God is saying, okay, move forward with the job, and what's going to happen as a result of it, why we have to ask what's going to happen. So men should slay one another. Well, wait a second, God. Well, why would you want men to slay each other? They're made in your image. But actually what's truthfully going on here and what we recognize is a cleansing process is now started. Jesus is going to be coming back soon. And while it's looking like everything's going wrong, believers need to understand it doesn't matter if we even die during this period of time, because we're going to be like that line in Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. I'll be back. See, we're going to be back. We're coming back. But a cleansing of the earth is now started, and this is some of that process for cleansing. Furthermore, it did mention that a great sword was given. In other words, to take all these lives, again, the ability to do it and whatever he needed to accomplish was given by God. So he will bring about much carnage. This is also applied in Ezekiel 38. Now, who is this Gog? Well, Gog is a spirit principality. We learn about principalities in Ephesians 6:10 and 12. This is a territorial ruler, and he is Gog of the Land of Magog, or that's Japheth's son, or one of his sons rather, and he occupied a particular part of the world which included Tubal, Rus, and Meshech. So these are all inclusives of his territorial reign. So he is the spirit entity behind the nation. Truthfully, politicians don't rule nations. There are spirits behind them that are guiding them in the direction, good or bad, that they are going. Now, how do I know Gog is a spirit principality? Well, let me look at some verses with you here, or at least mention the verses. Don't really have time to look at them. First of all, he was present in Ezekiel's day. In Ezekiel 31 and in Ezekiel 39, God told him to prophesy to God. So he had to be existent during the time of Ezekiel. That would be 500 years before Christ, okay? That are a little bit more than 500 years. Now, 2,500 years or over 2,500 years later, we are waiting for him to be active in the second event. And that's where we see it mentioned that Gog in Ezekiel 38:10 and 12 actually plans out the event and implements it. So what does that tell us? He is existent during the tribulation day event. He will be a present at that time. So over 2,500 years later, he is going to be present. And then it also tells us that he will be present at the end of Jesus Christ's 1,000-year reign. And that's in Revelation 27 and 8. So over a time span of well over 3,500 years, he's still there. Mel, we look at all these people in the Bible, not one of them lived more than 1,000 years. So it can't be human. It has to be a spirit principality or a territorial spirit that is in control of his region. It mentions in Ezekiel that he needed to prophesy to Gog of the land of Magog. Well, Magog was a son of Japheth, one of Noah's children, and from Mount Ararat he would have more than likely migrated to the north in this region here. So this is where his descendants would have lived, and this pretty much is the territorial control that is held by the spirit Gog. Now, it mentions and calls Gog the prince of Rush in Ezekiel 38, verse 3. It also calls him the prince of Meshech, which is another way of saying Moscow. And then it also mentions him as being the prince of Tubal, who some believe is the city of Tobolsk, which is in Siberia. Others believe it is a modern-day city, Tbilisi, in Georgia. However, that would simply mean that if we looked at these areas, these would be the areas right up here that God would actually own. The spirit God would control that territory. And that means he has other allies. We've already mentioned 3 of them. We mentioned Put, Libya, we mentioned Ethiopia, and we mentioned Iran. So these would be other countries that are joining into the fight that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38, verse 5. Then it tells us here, up over here, it mentioned Gomer with all his troops, which would pretty much tell us that we are now entering into the Eastern European region. So here would be where some of other allies would come down with Gog. And then it also talks about Togarmah, which would include Turkey and these regions over here surrounding the Black and the Caspian Seas. So we could have people as far as areas like Estonia and Latvia coming down, Lithuania, and moving all the way along the Eastern European area here, coming down. So you could imagine how massive some of these people are. It talks about them coming from all these particular areas. Then it goes on to say in Ezekiel 38, it says, many peoples with you. So there could be others. There could be people in Afghanistan and Pakistan included, or in other countries not yet identified at that time in the Bible, joining in as well. So what we want to do is notice that I've drawn some arrows. And this is where the entry points into this assault that is eventually going to come down into Israel more than likely is going to have its greatest strength. They will be coming down through northern Syria. Now, I mentioned the ruler of Syria was defeated, so this is currently occupied land by the Iraqis, which will be lost only for a short period and then recovered. Furthermore, I put the arrows that we already know about, the entry points into Egypt that are working their way toward Israel for Libya and the Ethiopians. In Daniel chapter 7, a metaphoric literal, is given on what God's human kingdom would be like. Now, it's given as a beast that resembles a bear in this passage, but there are a total of 4 beasts present in Daniel 7. One we identify because of Revelation 13 as being the Antichrist representation of a beast. None of them existed during the time that Daniel 17 was written. There's a winged lion and there's a 4-headed leopard, and then there's this one resembling a bear. Now, let me give you an explanation on what this kingdom basically seems to be like. Daniel 7:5 says, "And behold, another beast, the second one, resembling a bear. It was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus say to it, Arise and devour much flesh." Okay, we're going to get into Gog's campaign here, specifically the earlier part of the campaign. And the reason for that is there's so much information here in the Bible, and we're trying to put it in order, and we can't cover everything we would like in detail. But what you have here is the attacks of the bear. And I call that the attacks of the bear simply because this is what's given to us in the Daniel 7:5 description. Now, there are implications. First, there's implications about the other creatures that are represented or the other beasts. They're basically smaller than this one. This bear is the biggest of the beasts that are mentioned, with exception to the Antichrist beast, which at this particular point is not part of the picture. In other words, the Antichrist so far has been fighting on his own, and the other kings, the 7 other kings that are out there as part of this confederacy, have not decided to participate. He is pretty much on his own, with exception to the nation of Israel. Now, it says that this particular bear-like creature is raised up on one side. This shows that its advance is strongest on one side or one front. In essence, the attack that is coming from the north, because of the multitude of nations that are participating in it, give him an advantage. And that advantage is simply the fact that he is straighter on that one side. Also, it mentions that are 3 ribs, implying flesh. In other words, when in Genesis, when Adam's bone was removed, some Bible translations prefer to use the word flesh. The idea or implication behind the bones or the flesh between its teeth suggests that there are 3 initial victories. So what happens if we look at the map? We have this big attack, and it's obviously because he is greatest on the one side, coming from the north. The Antichrist cannot match the size. He's still running out of Egypt. He's still in retreat, working to advance into Israel to prepare for a counterattack. So this defeat goes exactly the way we would expect it to go. It would go in favor of Gog's forces. Then there is a second rib mentioned, and that would be a second defeat. Most likely, these defeats would come at the Turkey or Syrian or Iraqi borders first, and then into Syria second. The forces would be coming more than likely from Iraq, because the majority of forces that are held by Antichrist continue to remain in Egypt, yet they are getting closer to Israel. So as he is approaching, he continues to have Libya and the Ethiopians at his heels. He's moving closer to Israel, and Israel has joined at this particular point, more than likely, into the fight to protect itself from the coming Antichrist, I'm sorry, from the coming attack of Gog and all the allies that are under him. A third attack happens right outside of Israel, probably as they're getting closer and closer to the Golan Heights region. And ultimately, that would be the most likely point where Gog's forces could win a military victory. The ultimate outcome of these attacks is not only going to result with him devouring much meat, or some Bibles say flesh. It is telling us that they are going to be crucial to bringing about the death of much life on this planet Earth. So we've covered a lot on Gog, Antichrist, and Israel. Let me just kind of tell you where I think we would be at this particular point. By now, we are likely in the middle or the end of the second year of the tribulation period. A lot has happened, and more is going to continue to happen. Gog, he's advanced. He's positioned himself outside the mountains of Israel, probably far enough back so he is not hit with too much artillery, but he is getting ready to enter the land. His allies to the south are either nearing Israel's southern border or they are at it and they are waiting their orders from the Russian-led Confederacy. Antichrist, his army has been weakened from trying to prevent the forces of Gog from entering the land. Russia's won victory. All its allies have won victory. Its considerable size allows them to defeat the forces that he has sent. However, the main part of his army is now positioned in Israel. And this is what he had decided to do and escape from Egypt in order to prepare to defend Israel. Things are about to get very, very bad. We are going to see this thing escalate like we've never expected it to do so. It's hard to sometimes identify these things, but the worst part of the bird pangs are about to begin, and that happens when we have kingdom versus kingdom. So subscribe. This way you'll be able to see what happens to Gog, Antichrist, and the nation of Israel. Let's give you a couple of quick applications. I call them so now what? What do we have to do with what we learned? First thing we have to learn is that these things must happen. In other words, we cannot get to our eternal life and experience the eternal joy until prophecy is fulfilled. And these prophecies, as negative and as harmful as they are to our entire globe, they must happen. And why must they happen? And this is the second point to keep in mind. God is the one that's bringing it home. He's going to bring us home by fulfilling exactly what his word says. Our next episode for End Time Bible Fulfillments in sequential order, we will learn about the fall of Gog and another kingdom entering the fight. My name is Vince. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for joining me today. God bless.